What's up, alpha males? A long time ago, in a place far away, I had television. And I remember on television, there was Discovery Channel. And now it's probably reality TV or something. But back then, they may still do it. They did a thing called Shark Week. I was thinking, how about Knife Week? Maybe cool. Do a week of knife content on Alpha Male Podcast. Knives are pretty manly. And I'm going to be real with you guys. I put in the bio, but right now that's not in the older versions of the bio. I am private security contracting for the feds. Have gun, will travel. Anyway, I moved and took this job because it was supposed to be part-time, and I'm not complaining, but it's not as part-time as I thought it was going to be. So, I'll be honest, it's been a lot. So I thought, how could I get you guys some content, do something kind of cool on here. So, how about Knife Week on Alpha Male Podcast? Pull it in. You may get an episode or two pulled over from gunfighter life as well, because knives are one of those kind of things that transcends manliness and guns. It kind of ties into both. But without further ado, Knife Week on Alpha Male Podcast. What is going on, Alpha Males? Saddle up for another episode of Alpha Male Podcast, where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, with God at the center. We are made in His image, strong, dominant, in control. This episode, we're going to nerd out on knives. Get into the nitty-gritty of knives. Now, there are some real knife nerds out there. I consider myself a knife nerd. There are many people that know much more about knives than me. I'll generally put in a bio when I think it's germane, but I don't think it is in today's episode. I'm going to try and straddle the line of being interesting and learning more about knives, but not going so in depth that you lose a big chunk of the audience. I'm not going to talk about the edge retention on S30 versus S35 VN. I would like to hopefully give a lot of us out there a better understanding of knives and these terms that get thrown around. Because I think a lot of times, much like in the tactical world, if you don't know, there's a whole other podcast I'm blessed to do called Gunfighter Life. Talk about gun terms, and I think sometimes people can throw around terms like ballistics coefficient, sectional density, monolithic, free float, M-lock, handguard, just throwing out a bunch of terms when what they actually are is not super complicated. So today, as we dive into knives, I want to again, straddle that fence and making it interesting if you know a little bit about knives, but also not going so fast and so far that it loses a bunch of people. Now, where to start? I guess the two big categories today are folding knives and fixed blade knives. Now, since the folding mechanism is unique to the folding knife, let's cover that first. Now, to give credit where it's due, the first one that I looked up and had a good little picture with some illustrations was Blade HQ. I have no affiliation with them. I don't know that I've ever bought a knife from them. That was the first thing that popped up, and I like to give credit where it's due. And I guess before we get into the locking mechanisms, I guess when you go to folding knives, there are locking and non-locking knives. I have a simple knife that doesn't lock at all. Don't recommend those unless that's all you have or it's just like a secondary blade. There are so many good locking blades now. Unless it has sentimental value or something, why would you carry a non-locking blade when you can carry a locking blade? Or if there's a legal reason, there are actual places where they limit you to carrying a non-locking knife, which seems unsafe to me. But that's just a good reason I recommend a locking knife. Now, one of the classic ones that you might think of is the back lock. You might recognize this from like a classic Buck 110 or 112. You'll see like a half moon cutout on the back of the knife with a piece of metal in there. You press that down and that allows the knife to unlock. They're very strong. They're very simple. You've got a big hunk of metal. When it comes out, they kind of go together at a 180 degrees. Usually there's probably different designs, but they lock together. It's a very simple, strong design. Classic. They're not as easy to unlock one-handed, so there is that, but they are very strong. Another real common one is going to be the frame lock, and if you look at a folding knife, when you unfold it, obviously there's usually a piece on either side. When one of those pieces bends in, and there'll be usually a cutout section on the blade steel where it locks in. Frame comes in and locks into the blade. Those are cheap, they're affordable, they're pretty easy to unlock with one hand. You'll see those on a lot of knives, especially a lot of the more budget knives. The liner lock. The liner lock is a little bit more complicated in that you would have the two sides that make up the handle, then inside there you would have a liner. And one of those liners would bend in, kind of like a leaf spring. If you know what a leaf spring is on a car, on a revolver, the leaf spring will kind of go in. Not the entire grip, but just a part of the inside. The liners are good if you want to make handles out of different materials and you want a either lighter or more grippy or something other than metal on the handle, but you still want that same kind of system where it goes in. Also, frame lock, when it goes in, changes the grip of the knife because the frame actually moves. Not so on the liner lock. It's a smaller piece of metal usually than the frame lock, but it works pretty much the same way. Part of that knife comes in and locks into the blade steel. Now the axis lock, kind of made famous by Benchmade. I think they came up with it, or at least they had the patent for it. The patent is now expired, so I imagine you're going to see those on a lot of knives. But this basically has a bar that goes through the knife with a spring, and when you open it up, it locks it into place, and you can pull that down like a tab, and it will unlock it. Easy to do, one-handed and two-handed, a strong design. And again, I think since I believe the patent is expired, you'll probably see that on more and more knives now. And there is a slip joint knife, which is not really a locking knife. You might think of those in like your classic old-timer knives or something like that, like a case knife. I'm sure those knife companies make locking knives too, but they're just where you open it and it clicks. But if you shove down hard enough on that blade, it'll close on your fingers. Ask me how I know. Multiple stitches later. Don't just think that because it sounds like it locks that it actually locks. But slip joints, they're another real classic design, but I would not consider them a locking knife. Yes, any lock will break at some point. It doesn't require a lot of pressure on those to actually get them to fold. It just kind of holds the blade open. You're not putting a lot of pressure on it. And they're okay for like a classic, just secondary blade, or for very simple tasks like your classic Swiss Army knife, the Swiss Army knife Classic, Victorinox Classic. But for hard use, I would steer you towards a locking knife. Now the non-folding, the fixed blade knife. You'd think that's simple, it's just one piece of metal. But wait, there's more. Probably the most common, and you'll hear touted today as being a great advantage, is the full tang knife. Basically what this means is if you look at it, most of the time there'll be two scales. If it has some kind of handle, I guess it doesn't have to, but most do. Two sides of a handle that are bolted, riveted, attached somehow to that solid piece of steel that goes all the way through and all the way out the back. A full tang knife. These obviously are very strong if they're made with good steel. And they're pretty, I would say, easy to produce. Just cut out the knife and then attach the handles to them. So they're strong, they're common, fairly easy to make. Because of that, they are kind of overhyped. If you think about the amount of steel in that handle on like a big fixed blade knife, it's probably pretty superfluous. Meaning it's probably much more than is necessary. If you can get a semi-tang knife, it could still be very strong, meaning the tang that goes into the handle is much smaller. With modern blade steels, they're so strong, you can get a lot less steel back there, still have it be very strong, and quite a bit lighter. So don't think that you always need a full tang knife, but they are kind of the default. For instance, like a K-bar, a classic knife, I'll probably refer to it a lot because a lot of people probably can picture it. I don't believe that's a full tang knife. That tang is tapered down. And even Marines don't manage to break a lot of K-bars. That allows it to be lighter than like a full tang knife. There's all kinds of going from your full tang to partial tangs. I do like a tang that goes all the way to the back of the knife, but I don't think it's necessary for it to be the entire width of the handle. But anyway, I guess I should say the main advantage, and throughout history, most knives have been fixed blades. So folding knives go back very old. I think the oldest one I saw was like ancient Rome. Fixed blade knives are simple. That's one of the big advantages. There's no locking system. It's like one piece of steel. I guess you can break the handles, but even if you break the handles, you can still use the knife. And on handles, let's talk about handles. Classic wood is a very classic handle material. And not all wood is created equal. You can get some really cheap garbage wood, some really, really good impervious to a lot of elements, impregnated, laminated, all kinds of really good wood that, if you take care of it, will last generations. Again, you can get some really cheap garbage wood. So you see wood on both ends of the spectrum. You see really cheap knives with wood. You see really expensive knives with wood. Another real classic one is leather. A real classic way to do this, again, going back to the K-bar, you cut out a bunch of leather patches and run the tang through them and stack them up and then trim them into the size of a handle. Stack leather washers that are pre-cut together. See this on a lot of classic knives. Again, the K-bar, the old school Air Force survival knife. Real classic way to make a knife. And you'll see a lot of knives like this. The other classic one is metal. Metal scales. A lot of the older knives will have a metal handle. That's just steel or brass or aluminum, usually cut with some kind of checkering to make it grippier with grooves. But metal is also a classic handle. You'll see some knives today with like aluminum scales, or if it's real fancy, titanium scales. And what people would consider today a lot of the cream of the crop. Micarta and G10. Now micarta, if you know anything about fiberglass, but except for fiberglass, it's just some other material. You can literally make it out of blue jeans. There is blue jean micarta. But it's basically taking some kind of fabric and impregnating it with a resin. Canvas is a real popular one. If you know, canvas is nothing special, but you impregnate it with whatever the other compound is, and you get a really durable, impervious to the elements, lasts a long time. I'm not going to say forever, because nothing that man makes lasts forever. If you want forever stuff, you look to God. But micarta is really impervious to a lot of stuff. It stays grippy when it's wet. It can be fairly lightweight. Make it in a variety of different colors. And then the other big one today, the other kind of Gucci one, is G10. And you might argue which one is better. And G10 is just stacked layers usually. I guess it could be all one piece, but a lot of the appeal is the different layers, different color layers. A composite material stacked together. These also can be very impervious. I think they're a little bit heavier in general than micarta. They also can be very grippy. They're really impervious to different things, different chemicals. I'm sure there's some chemicals that would interact with them, but most things aren't going to hurt G10 or micarta. Not going to soak up water if they're done right. They're not going to soak up blood. Now, you still might have to worry about that stuff getting in between the handle material and the blade steel and in the grooves and stuff. But as far as getting into the handle, like you leave wood long enough and water, it will soak up that water. But G10 and micarta shouldn't do that. Blood can get into a leather or a wood handle and stain it. It shouldn't do that. Again, if it's made right, it shouldn't do that with a micarta or G10. You get some aging and discoloration on the micarta or G10, but it's not going to really soak in that material and damage it like some other older materials would. Okay, now I guess we talk about the steel. Now, traditionally there are, and I say traditionally going back a few decades, there are two main camps. Traditionally, your high carbon steel and your stainless steel. Your high carbon steel, the most common one is probably 1095. It's still used a lot today. It's still a great knife steel. It's very strong. It's very good to sharpen. Easy to sharpen, holds an edge well. Just regular 1095 is not very stainless. Then you have your classic stainless steels, which are going to be, there's all kinds of different letters. And again, I don't want to go too nerdy, but like your 420s and your 440s. As with either one of these, heat treat is super important, but you can get some pretty good knife steel with just the old-fashioned 420, 440s if it's heat treated right. I should say stainless is in the name. It means stainless. Stainless will still rust. It will still rust if you don't take care of it. Any steel, any iron can rust that you make knives out of, I think, if it's going to hold a decent edge. But stainless. And that can be important depending on your environment or how well you take care of a knife or don't take care of your knife. Going back a little bit, a lot of the high carbon steels like 1095 and things like that, sometimes they'll be coated with something to protect the blade. Again, going back to the K-bar. A lot of the modern knives like that you'll see will be coated with some kind of, well, I don't want to get into all the different coatings, but some kind of coating. A lot of the high carbon steels, the 1095s, or things similar to that, will have some kind of coating because the blades do back to the elements a little bit more. And the stainless ones, as we talked about, in general, they're not going to hold an edge as well or be as strong as the high carbon steels, because that's kind of your dichotomy there. And then you have your new generation, which are your super steels, your powdered metallurgy steels. And I guess the first big one that I was aware of was S30V. It's a really good steel. And there's all kinds of different steels. There's 3V, there's Magna Cut now. That's the new hotness. Who knows what the new hotness will be in a year or two. But these are not just hype. I thought for a while, like, who would pay that much for a knife? And then I actually got one. I got it used, got a good deal on an S30V knife. And I used it, and I was like, wow. The amount of time and use I could put on a knife and still have it be crazy sharp, I was impressed. Thought, oh, how could that knife that, costs hundreds of dollars really be worth it when I can get a knife that basically looks the same that's $40 or $50? Well, because of the steel, that's how. And that S30V, and that's a pretty basic super steel, if I can use that term, so much better than a lot of other just regular steels. They are really, really good. They're called super steels for a reason. So, and super steels have different metallurgy, and I don't want to get too nerdy, but depending on what you want, if you want a really thin, strong steel for like defense or a Tonto for whatever reason, you might look at 3V. Really good all-around steels. The new hotness is Magna Cut. And a lot of these balance that with having really good edge retention, being really strong, being pretty stain resistant, being a form of stainless steel, having that powdered metallurgy, which means they're generally stronger, have less imperfections throughout the steel than your classic way of making steel. And again, there's a lot that goes into that. Heat treating is really important. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but in general, like a really good heat-treated Magna Cut steel is going to be better than a really good heat-treated 440 steel, depending on what you want. If you just want a cheap knife to abuse, then probably go with the 440. Super steels, I think, absolutely are a thing. They're not just hype. They actually have performance enhancements. And one I skipped over that I'm going to go back to, not a super steel, not even a really new steel, but I see it a lot more now in budget knives, and that's D2 steel. D2 is not technically stainless. I forget what like the parts per whatever to be stainless is, and it doesn't make that, but it's just under it. D2 is a really well-known tool steel, but you'll see it in kind of your, I guess, mid-grade or higher-end affordable knives. D2 has good edge retention. It's fairly stain-resistant. I guess it's not technically a stainless steel. It's a good all-around. It is, however, fairly hard to sharpen, just a regular stone, so just be aware of that. Is one of the trade-offs you get. If you get a really high edge retention knife, usually it's going to be harder to sharpen because the steel itself is harder, if that makes sense. Maybe you're the kind of person that just wants a really easy steel to sharpen, like Victorinox steel or a 440. Want it easy to sharpen, and if it gets dull fast, that's okay because you're just going to sharpen it a lot. Maybe you're the kind of guy that wants to be able to make it through butchering an entire elk, which I can appreciate, and still have a sharp knife. Probably want to go with a higher-end steel for that. Anyway, I don't want to get too nerdy into the steel, so let's move on. I guess the other real big one is going to be the point of the knife. I'll start with my general personal favorite, and that is a clip point knife. A lot of things. Clip point knives are the ones that the back of the knife is flat and straight and it drops down. Again, think of your classic K-bar. A lot of knives that call themselves Bowie knives, but your classic Bowie knife. A big advantage for these, they're very good at penetrating and going into stuff. I like that. The detractors will say they're not as strong, but a lot of the classic go-to like combat utility knives, like a K-bar, have a clip point. Also like a clip point for hunting and guiding, which I do a lot of for butchering, because I like to put my index finger right on the tip of that knife and it kind of lays on there nice, so it basically makes a sharp finger. I can reach up in there and carve out a heart and carve out the liver and all that stuff. Really kind of fine, delicate work with a sharp knife. I like that feel of the clip point. It's real classic looking. The other big one is going to be your drop point. It drops off just kind of at a straight line. So the back of the knife is, if you picture it level and flat, and it drops off to a point, but it doesn't bend in. A drop point blade. It's also a good classic design. If I had a really good knife, I mean, I prefer a clip point, but I wouldn't shun a drop point. those two are probably your best all-around points on a knife. Also the spear point, which if you look at it is symmetrical, even if both sides are not sharpened. If you looked at it from a distance, it would just look like a spear point. It's an obvious name. Both sides kind of come together in the middle. See these on a lot of classic fighting knives and dirks and daggers. Very symmetrical, very good at puncturing for stabbing. That's what a lot of them are used for. Not exclusively, but you'll see it on a lot of classic, like a Fairbairn Sykes. A lot of the classic, even going back to ancient Egyptian, ancient Roman daggers. That kind of dagger point, spear point blade. It can be of varying tapers. You can get them really, really thin and pointy, like a classic Fairbairn Sykes, or much, squattier, much more abrupt angle to a point, like your Applegate Fairbairn. But obviously, to varying degrees, the thinner and pointier it gets, the better it's going to penetrate, but the more fragile the tip is going to be. So it's a trade-off there. Another real common one is the tanto. There's your classic Japanese tanto. You don't see a lot unless you're talking about classic Japanese stuff. And the American tanto, and it's basically, the American tanto is basically, if you look at the bottom, usually the main edge will be fairly flat and straight, and then it will have a sharp edge up, let's say 45 degrees, and they're probably not 45 degrees, but so you can picture it in your head, a 45 degree upshot to the top of the blade. These are also really good at penetrating and shoving into stuff, especially hard stuff, without breaking. They're not as fragile a tip. You'll see these in a lot of urban knives, a lot of like urban fighting knives, a tanto point. People will say they're hard to sharpen. I disagree with that. I just think you got to sharpen them differently. If all you've ever sharpened is a drop point knife, then yeah, it's going to be, if you're trying to sharpen a tanto the same way, it might be harder. But if you sharpen it the way you're supposed to sharpen a tanto, not super hard. They are a robust, very good at penetrating tip. But all tips on all knives can break. It's just kind of, if you just look at it, common sense will tell you if all the steels were equal and they're not, which one would be more fragile. Okay, I guess we should talk about the blade. There are single edge and double edge knives. Obviously the double edge is sharpened on both sides. You'll see these on classic daggers. And going back to the fighting knives, the Fairbairn Sykes, Applegate Fairbairn, the classic, a lot of the classic, shouldn't say all, but a lot of the classic, like military daggers, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Romans. But they're sharpened on both sides. This obviously gives you an advantage in being able to cut with both sides. Can be a big advantage. I think you give up, though, a lot of utility if you want to use it as a day-to-day cutting knife, because you can't put your hand or your thumb or whatever on the back of the blade. You can't really choke up on it without cutting yourself. Times you want to choke up, going back to like butchering an animal. That I couldn't butcher an animal with a dagger. You certainly could. It'd be better than not having a sharp piece of steel, but it's not ideal for it. For different fighting techniques, like if you want to be able to put your other hand on the back of the blade and shove down. So there's a give and take there, but the double-edged. And in general, I refer to those as a dagger. You'll also see on some fighting knives, the front portion, especially on like a clip point blade, that back part will also be sharpened, giving you a little bit of ability to slice both directions, but where the main part of the back of the blade is not sharpened. The spine. Now that, different versions of a double edge. And I should say the spine, the back of the blade, if you're talking about generally a non-sharpened knife, obviously somehow you have to go from the back of that blade, which is generally the full width of the blade, to a very sharp point. And there are so many ways to do that. You would think that would be simple, but it's not. You have, let's say, like a chisel grind, where you just literally sharpen one side. You'll see this on a lot of really cheap knives, where one side is just flat, and one side literally is tapered down. Obviously, you see that on cheap knives because it's easier to do one thing than two in general. So that, like chisel, and there's reasons for it. Obviously, chisels are made that way for a reason, to cut one way. So there are advantages to that if that's what you want to do. But you'll see that a lot. And on cheaper knives, a chisel grind. I should say grind to me just means how you get it from the thick part of the blade to the point. And there's all kinds of different grinds. And I guess I don't want to go too nerdy on this. Just use common sense. Again, if all blade steels are equal, and they're not, so you can get away with different grinds on stronger steels. But in general, if it goes to a very abrupt, really thick part of the blade to the point very abruptly, that's obviously going to be stronger, again, if all steels are equal. If you think about an axe, If you look at the blade of an axe, that has a pretty immediate taper. If you look at the blade of a chisel, it has a pretty immediate and dramatic taper to the blade, because those things should be strong. You don't want them to break. If you look at something like a kitchen knife or a steak knife in general, they're very thin, even at the top, and they're very long from the top to the blade. And they have a very gradual tapering down. You want them to slice well. Probably not trying to, or the back of them with a hammer and get them through something, swinging them at a log. Can have a much more gentle taper, and they generally slice a lot better. And there's all different kinds in between. But just when you look at the knife, look at how much it tapers, consider how strong the steel is. In general, a more gradual taper is going to make it I guess slicier is a term, I'm going to use it. The ability to slice is going to be greater, assuming, again, steel and they both have an equal edge. But obviously, if it's a really fine, thin taper, it's going to be, again, if the steels are equal, likely to chip, break, things like that. It's a give and take on that. If one was superior, then all knives would have that thing. But I guess, what do you want it to do? I guess, talking about the edge, we should also talk about serrations. Now, there are some knives that have the complete blade serrated. Those are more specialty knives. Most of the knives, for general purpose, are either going to have no serrations, just a straight edge, or they're going to have partial serrations, back where the blade meets the handle. Now, there's a lot of give and take here. A lot of people really don't like serrations. I'm not totally against them. They are really good at cutting through rope, through fabric. They can be kind of a saw if you really need it to be a saw. Obviously not as good as a actual saw. They can be that if you need that. Also, let's be honest, for people that don't really sharpen their knives that often and their knife they have is super dull, if their knife is so dull it's almost useless as a knife, a lot of times the serrations will still cut. And you might say that shouldn't be a thing, but that is a thing. The downside to serrations is they're fairly hard to sharpen unless you have specific like sharpening rods and ability to do that. So if you just have a stone or even one of those even more simple like pull-through knife sharpeners, you're not probably going to be able to sharpen those serrations. They take more time. They're kind of more of a pain in the butt to sharpen, but if you have the tools and you know how, they're not super hard to sharpen. Also, if you're trying to do fine, delicate work with them, like shave down a stick or something like that, you probably don't want to do that with the serrations, and the serrations are usually against the handle, which is the part of the knife you probably want to do that work with. So it's a give and take. If it's like a carry for emergency kind of rescue combat tool, okay. If you want a really good fine cutting edge all the way through the knife, then don't go with the partial serrations. Okay, real quick, we're going to touch on sheaths. See, most folding knives, you're just going to go in your pocket. I would advise you to have one with a clip, especially if it's going to be for any kind of defense. That way it's always oriented in the correct manner, in the correct place, so you can grab it. But if you're talking a fixed blade knife, a lot of them are going to have sheaths. 3 real common ones I can think of are your fabric sheaths. Most notably and common, I think, is your ballistic nylon. These are kind of good because they will dry out quickly, though they also can bend and stuff like that. And real classically is your leather sheath. These can be really durable. They can look really nice. They can last a long time if you take care of them. If you oil them, if you put like ballistol or, saddle soap on them and actually take care of them, leather can be really robust and last a long time. If you don't take care of them, you let them dry out, they can crack. You let them soak in water for a long time, they can get nasty, break down. It's leather, it's skin, so it will rot. Then you have Kydex. Kydex is hard, so it's not going to, it can bend, but in general it doesn't bend. It's really impervious to the elements. You could, unless the actual metal rivets, and if they're brass, probably not, but you could, dump a Kydex sheath in salt water for a month and come back and the sheath would probably be fine. The other two, probably not so much. Also, in general, the other two types of sheaths are generally going to have some kind of active retention. They're going to have some kind of strap or snap to hold the actual knife in. Kydex, a lot of time, can be molded in such a way that the blade can just be shoved in and snap in. So you can just pull it and pull it out, as opposed to a lot of other sheaths. So those are your main sheath materials. Nothing crazy there, just common sense. You'll see a lot of like hybrids. You'll see like a ballistic nylon sheath with a Kydex insert or something like that. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what knife you should get for whatever. Think about it for yourself. Think critically. What are you trying to do? What attributes are important to you? Is super lightweight important to you? Is super ruggedness important to you? Do you want a knife that's good at penetrating stuff? Do you want a knife that's good at slicing stuff? Do you want really good edge retention, or you just want a knife that you can sharpen easy? It can be a lot wading into the world of knives. So hopefully this was a really good basic flyover of kind of the basic knives and the differences between them. There's stuff that I didn't cover. There's like the Wharncliffe. You kind of think of as like a reverse Tonto with the straight edge on the back being on the front. There's other locking mechanisms that I didn't cover. Try to cover the most common ones. And we could go down knife steel rabbit hole for forever. Probably do an entire other podcast on just different steels. But I'm not that guy. I'm not a metallurgist. Hopefully today was helpful. I know a little bit dry if you're not super crazy about knives, but if you're thinking about maybe upping your knife game, you've just been EDCing whatever knife was cheap at Walmart, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to kind of move up and you're thinking about a more purpose-built specialty tool. Because of all the things we spend money on that we put in a drawer and forget about, or we order on Amazon and a year later we're like, why did I even buy this thing? If it's going to be your EDC knife or your bug out bag knife or whatever, that has the potential for being really important, especially EDC stuff that you carry every day. Something that you put your hands on over and over again and use every day. I think that should usually get a little bit more thought, perhaps a little bit more quality. Anyway, with that, I'm going to wrap up this episode. If you thought this content or any of the other content was worth $1, consider supporting for $1. Should be a Patreon link in the show notes. You can become a patron if you want to support the show. Just want to give $1 or $2. There's also a Venmo link. You can just drop $1 or $2. With that, your tactical tip of the day. Okay, so the tactical tip, one thing I like to do is have a secondary, what I would call sacrificial blade in my pocket. For me, a lot of times that's a little small Victorinox. The Victorinox Classics are good. They're cheap. Again, that steel is not the best edge retention, but it's easy to sharpen. And if I'm doing something like opening a bunch of boxes, cutting a bunch of tape, I like to use my sacrificial blade because my main go-to EDC blade, I like to keep it sharp. I'll generally EDC a fixed blade knife in addition to my concealed carry weapon, my firearm on the opposite side, so I have a defensive option on both sides. That knife, if I'm going to use it for defense, I want it sharp. And it's not that I'll never use it, but if I'm doing something that's going to really dull a blade, like cut a bunch of tape, cut a bunch of boxes, I'll use that small sacrificial blade. And they don't have to be expensive. Anyway, just a small sacrificial blade. That's my tactical tip of the day. Tactical verse of the day. A hard teaching from Jesus, but we shouldn't shy away from the truth. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of your parts. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. The wages of sin is death, men. Take that seriously, as serious as having to cut off your own arm. It is a grievous, grievous thing, and it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. One day we will face the judgment seat. Let's make sure we're keeping our spirit, soul, mind, body focused on what's really important, on God. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.